Following the negative reception to Resident Evil 6, and knowing that they couldn't spend such an exorbitant amount of money on another poorly received title like that, the developers at Capcom decided to take things back to the roots of the series for the next mainline entry. The decision was made to go back to a smaller scale story and return to the classic survival horror style that originally popularized the series. They even appointed Koshi Nakanishi as the director of this new title, as he was the director of the first Revelations title, and that project, released right before Resident Evil 6, was much more horror-oriented and was received much better by fans and critics alike at the time of its release. They were going all in on bringing Resident Evil back to what had made people fall in love with it in the first place, even naming the game Resident Evil 7 Biohazard in the West as a little nod to the franchise's original name in Japan. But of course, the question is, would it actually pay off for them? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 24th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you might enjoy them if you're a big Resident Evil fan, or just want to know what I think about other entries in the series. So for those of you who are interested in checking those out first, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC in 2017. Along with taking the series back to what had made it so popular in the first place, the developers knew that they would have to make some pretty bold changes here in order to catch people's attention and hopefully bring them back to the franchise. So right at the start of the game, we're introduced to our new protagonist, Ethan Winters. Ethan's wife, Mia Winters, went missing 3 years ago, but one day, he receives an email from her out of the blue saying that she's in Dulvey, Louisiana, and that he needs to come get her and bring her home. So even though he's not really sure if this is real or just someone messing with him, Ethan sets off to the middle of nowhere in Louisiana to find his missing wife, eventually arriving at the address that was sent to him and finding a seemingly abandoned ranch. As he makes his way inside though, we find more and more disturbing things the further in we get, leading to a setting that not only feels totally new to the series in terms of locale, but also with its new grindhouse horror aesthetic. I mean seriously, everywhere you go in this game just feels so grungy, dirty, and at times even just flat out violent. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself though. Ethan eventually manages to find Mia locked up in a cell in the basement of this house, but she seems to be behaving very erratically and keeps telling him that they need to get out of here before he finds them. On the way out, she randomly starts attacking Ethan with seemingly superhuman strength, and trying to defend himself, he ends up putting a hatchet into the side of her neck, seemingly killing her. But after we leave the room and come back, her body is gone. We run into her a couple more times during this opening, repeatedly putting her down only for her to get back up, before we're suddenly knocked out by a large man and wake up to meet the owners of this ranch, the Baker family. These guys are clearly insane, feasting on a buffet of human organs right in front of Ethan, and even force-feeding them to him when he refuses to eat on his own. A fight between the family members eventually causes them to all leave the room though, giving Ethan his chance to escape and try to find a way out of the house, and this is where the game really begins. This is obviously a very different story setup than the sort of things that we're used to in the Resident Evil series, but one that's definitely compelling in its own way. It really feels like you're back playing RE1 for the first time, just finding yourself in this awful situation with no context as to what's really going on and needing to find a way out as soon as possible. And we're already left with a lot of questions. Who is this family, and why are they living in this rundown ranch? If they're cannibals, then why have they been holding our wife captive for over 3 years instead of just killing and eating her? What was going on with Mia where she was seemingly going insane and activating some sort of superhuman abilities? Do the other members of the family have similar abilities? There are so many dangling threads put in front of the player during this introduction that they'll naturally want answers to. And believe me, the game will only introduce more and more questions as it goes on. And while it feels very self-contained and disconnected from the rest of the series in the beginning, you'll also slowly get hints as you progress through the game that what's happening here might be more tied into the overall narrative of the series than you might initially think. Getting into the game itself though, I feel like we can't talk about anything else before covering the perspective change. Resident Evil 7 was the first mainline title in over a decade to move away from the over-the-shoulder perspective established in Resident Evil 4, and instead has brought us a first-person perspective for the first time in the series. This was a pretty controversial move among longtime fans, with many saying that this was a lazy attempt to turn Resident Evil into a first-person shooter. But what a lot of people don't actually know is that this was yet another decision that was made to take the RE franchise back to its roots. See, the original Resident Evil back on PS1 was initially planned to be a fully 3D first-person horror game, but this vision changed when the team realized just how poor the visuals and performance would be if they tried to make that kind of game on the PS1. This led to them using fixed camera angles similar to some of the other early horror games that came before RE1, and while not much of that initial vision has been preserved outside of developers talking about it in interviews, we do still have some of the early concept art for the game that showcases what they wanted it to look like when they first started planning it. So ultimately, this perspective change is just another piece of the team going back to the roots of the series. We have a first-person horror game set in a strange estate where we're playing as totally new characters that we don't know much about, and really just have no idea what's going on until the final act of the story. And beyond all that, I personally just feel like this new perspective works really well for RE7. Being so close to everything in this game is really immersive, and that high degree of immersion, along with just how disturbing a lot of this game actually is, makes it one of the most genuinely unsettling games in the franchise. Not outright scary in my opinion, but certainly uncomfortable. Now, aside from that, the presentation is a pretty mixed bag in this game. But starting with the positives, I have to say that the environment design and the atmosphere in this one are absolutely stellar. The aesthetic of a large Southern American home that's been deteriorating for years while the family has just let it rot was nailed perfectly here, I feel. Some parts of the home still look relatively good, albeit a bit dirty, but you can still tell that this is a pretty nice house, right? But then other parts of the home feel like they're barely even standing anymore, as the family has just failed to maintain them after years of Louisiana storms and flooding, leading to a nice progression as you go from the fairly nice main house in the early game to the old house that feels like it's quite literally falling apart around you. And the sound design is also just immaculate in RE7. Down to all the little details like the subtle echo of your footsteps down a hallway or the creaking of wood as you hear the house settling around you. All this together creates an incredibly thick and heavy atmosphere that you'll feel the weight of throughout your entire playthrough. Something else that I love about this game's presentation is that the heads-up display is super minimal here, as it is in most Resident Evil games, but RE7's use of the first-person perspective alongside this more restrained HUD design really lends a lot to just how immersive of an experience this can be. The only downside with the HUD here is that they use this awful blood overlay to reflect your health at any given moment, meaning you'll have this annoying blood on the screen for most of your playthrough. And I know that John is going to go down and yell at me in the comments that you can just turn this off in the settings, but I like to look at the games that I cover in these videos as the developers intended them to be experienced, even if there's an option in the settings to disable or change some of those smaller things that I personally dislike. It's just respectful to the vision, you know? Speaking of settings though, we have to talk about something that I didn't remember about this game, but that was easily the most disappointing part of my recent revisit to it. That being that this game runs on Capcom's, at the time, brand new in-house engine, the RE engine. Resident Evil 7 was actually the first ever retail RE engine title that was released, and oh man can you feel the growing pains with it. There are very few people out there who would disagree with you if you said that the RE engine is one of the best looking and most powerful game engines on the market right now. And I remember RE7 being a stunning visual showcase of this impressive engine. But man, playing through it again for this video, I think this game actually looks kind of bad. There are the smaller things that I've heard a ton of people talk about over the years, like how the faces look pretty bad in this one, and the hair physics being just... yeah. But what I found during this recent playthrough is that the worst part of this game, visually speaking, was actually the implementation of some horrifically poor post-processing effects. And by far the worst offender here is the game's implementation of anti-aliasing. For those of you watching who don't know what anti-aliasing is meant to do, which I would assume is going to be a good number of you, the quickest way that I could explain it without getting too technical about it would be that it's supposed to get rid of jagged edges like these by slightly blurring the image output of the game itself. Just a tiny bit of blur that's really not noticeable while playing, but is present enough to smooth out stuff like this. But Resident Evil 7 does not do this. If you select some of the more aggressive anti-aliasing settings, the image gets incredibly blurry, like to a distracting degree. But if you choose one of the more restrained or balanced settings, it doesn't even get rid of those jagged edges. It just slightly blurs the overall image to a degree that you can see, by the way, which is already more than it should be doing, while still somehow showing lots of weird shimmering and jaggies pretty much everywhere. And the worst part of it all, there's no option to just turn off the anti-aliasing. So you're stuck with choosing between a slightly blurry image that still has all sorts of weird visual issues everywhere, or just a super blurry overall image. And keep in mind that all of the footage I recorded for this video is running on the PC version of the game at 4K resolution with all settings maxed out. And yet, it still just looks fairly low quality a lot of the time, especially in the outdoor areas. I mean, when I first started playing the game, there were like 3 occasions where I just stopped playing because I thought that something was seriously broken, and I went to Google to try to fix it, just to be met with the answer over and over again that this is simply how the game looks. There are other issues here with the engine simply being used pretty poorly, but in the interest of not letting this video turn into an overly technical rant piece, let's just say that the game looked great at the time of its release and definitely has some amazing art direction, but it's also aged pretty poorly compared to every other RE engine title on the market. Now, getting into the gameplay, things are similarly mixed. Let me start off with the other major component that makes a lot of longtime RE fans think that RE7 is a lazy cash grab: the game's opening hour. The opening hour of a game is easily the most important part of the experience to nail down, not just because first impressions are important, but also because this is the part of the game that players will use to decide whether or not they should actually play the rest of it. So in that opening hour, you want to set the tone for the rest of the game, while also giving players a great introduction to the gameplay that leaves them wanting more of it. The first hour is so important, in fact, that many developers will put off making the game's introduction until they've made the majority of the rest of the game. And this is purely so that they can have the best idea of the game's strengths and weaknesses that they possibly can when going into making what is essentially their game's hook. And I give you all of that context just to say that Resident Evil 7's introductory hour is awful, and quite frankly does the opposite of setting the tone and leaving players with a strong first impression. I've actually already described the game's opening hour in great detail during that introduction to the game's story, as everything that happens up until Ethan breaks out of that chair at the dining room table takes a little over 50 minutes to get through, and is exactly what I'm going to be talking about here. The big problem here is that nothing about this introduction actually reflects the gameplay of the rest of the game. That might sound like an exaggeration, but it really isn't. At no point in this introduction will you be looking for key items, solving puzzles, managing your inventory space, or fighting terrifying bioweapons. The entire first hour of this game just involves you walking down a linear path exactly where the game wants you to in order to trigger the next part of the cinematic introduction sequence. It's actually wild just how little this game's introduction actually showcases what the game is like, and it led to a lot of longtime RE fans writing 7 off as a lazy Outlast clone on its initial release, because you play about an hour of the game and you still haven't seen a single piece of that classic Resident Evil formula rear its head yet. But thankfully, once you're through that introduction, this game is quintessential Resident Evil down to its very core. You'll be slowly exploring this large estate that doesn't have much to find at first, but as you solve puzzles and find key items, you'll slowly start to open up the house and uncover more areas. And the whole time that you're doing that, you'll be finding weapons, ammo, and healing items that will provide you some defenses against the other horrors that are stuck in the house with you. The balancing is near perfect here as well, as you'll always have just enough ammo or healing items to get by, but you'll never be so flush with resources that encounters with enemies aren't still incredibly stressful. And in the event that you get too careless and start spraying your ammo everywhere, assuming that enemies are going to drop some back for you like the last few mainline entries, you'll quickly find yourself with no defenses left against the monsters, which means that you're probably gonna die, but even if you don't, you're gonna be running around burning through all of your healing items while trying to find more ammo, and you're just gonna have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time.
Every bit of RE7's core gameplay feels like you're playing a classic PS1 era Resi title, just in a new Grindhouse-inspired first-person coat of paint. And I have to say, after doing a whopping 14 videos of this retrospective since the last time that we covered an actual survival horror RE game, it really felt nice to be back. Now, I know that I already talked about the HUD a bit, but I really have to mention the slick new inventory menu they made for this game too. Instead of having a fade out to a full inventory screen like in the older games, you can now just press your inventory button to have an inventory overlay appear on the side of the screen, without actually interrupting the gameplay itself. You can then navigate through the inventory slots here by using the D-pad on your controller or the WASD keys on mouse and keyboard in a way that feels shockingly natural and smooth. They've also brought back the feature of being able to view every single item in the game in 3D and move it around, which is now also just overlaid on top of the gameplay instead of being its own menu. And much like the RE1 remake and RE0 did, they've used this system to add a ton of little interactions with the various things you'll find, like hiding extra items inside of boxes or on the underside of seemingly random objects, or even leaving notes stuck to the back of some key items to give you an idea of where they're supposed to go. They've also added this really intuitive crafting system in a separate tab of the inventory that feels like a very natural evolution of what RE3 had. You'll be able to find items like herbs or gunpowder around the environments, and then if you can also find some specific chemicals, these things can be combined to create these brand new first aid medicines that can be used with the press of a single button, or, of course, just more ammo for your various weapons in the case of the gunpowders. Much like RE3, this gives players a little more control over what inventory items they can have at certain points in the game, and offers a whole new layer of strategy on top of the typical survival horror gameplay, so of course I'm a pretty big fan of this. The only thing I really dislike about this new inventory is that a lot of items like your ammo or your heals actually have a limit to how many can be stacked in a single inventory slot. So if you manage to stack up more than 30 handgun rounds or 3 first aid meds, you're going to have to start using more inventory slots to actually carry that stuff around. This is offset a bit by the fact that you'll find multiple inventory expansions over the course of the game, allowing you to more than double your carrying capacity from the beginning to the end of it. So it's definitely an understandable change, just a bit annoying. Overall though, this new inventory system is great and way nicer to use than any other inventory in the series so far. But of course, micromanaging your limited supply of ammo and healing items is only actually scary if there's something trying to kill you, and that brings us to the new enemies of Resident Evil 7, the Molded. These are large monsters that are quite literally made out of mold, which might seem like something that's pretty crazy without proper context, but actually makes sense if you've played the game. But believe me when I tell you, the context in-game really only makes it crazier. Regardless though, these guys take the place of your basic enemy, similar to the zombies from the classic era titles or the Ganados from RE4. And there's something about these guys that just really stresses me out when they get close. And it's weird because I can't really put my finger on why, but they seriously freak me out when they're starting to run me down way more than any other enemies in the entire franchise. And aside from just looking pretty freaky, they're also fairly tricky to deal with. To counter the new first-person perspective and the quick and accurate aiming that players will now be capable of with it, the molded sway around in a really unnatural and unpredictable fashion, making it surprisingly difficult to actually aim for the head and put them down quickly. So they're difficult to deal with and are decently scary to boot, making them a solid Resident Evil enemy. But anyone who's actually played RE7 before likely knows where we're going here, and that's the issue of the enemy variety in this game. Because, you see, the molded are the only enemies you'll fight in this game outside of the unique boss fights. And while there are a few different variations of them, there aren't many. You've got your basic molded with a blade for an arm that also have much more health, your four-legged molded that have less health but can pounce at you from far away and kill you very quickly, and your fat molded that act as a sort of mini-boss. So even though there's some decent variety between them from a gameplay standpoint, just having 4 variations of mold monsters doesn't exactly make for the most interesting roster of enemies. And something that's a very weird addition to the combat of this game is the new blocking mechanic that they've added. In Resident Evil 7, getting hit by an enemy will lead to you taking a ton of damage, but that damage can be mitigated by just hitting the guard button right before the attack connects and putting your arms up to take some of the impact. You'll still take damage when doing this properly, but it will only be about a third of the damage that you would take otherwise. And this is a mechanic that I just don't really feel needs to be there. I get that the developers were trying to add some sort of defensive mechanic to make things a bit more engaging during the combat, but it feels a bit out of place to me, and if we're being totally honest, just silly. I mean, I get that putting your arms up and bracing for an attack can take some of the force out of it, but it's a bit hard to believe that it would be very effective when you're up against 8-foot-tall mold monsters, or especially bioweapons that are the size of a whole house. It's not a bad mechanic or anything, just one that I've always thought felt a bit random. Another mechanic that feels a bit random at first is the addition of a currency system in the form of these new antique coins. These coins are some of the most well-hidden items in the game, but if you can find enough of them, you'll be able to exchange those coins for a handful of incredibly valuable items. From permanent upgrades that increase your max health or speed up your reloads, to even acquiring the magnum of this game, finding as many antique coins as you can throughout your playthrough will be rewarded very handsomely. And weirdly, I'm actually a pretty big fan of these. They aren't like the currency systems of RE4 or 5 where enemies will just drop big shiny coins for you on death. Instead, they're tucked in parts of the environments that you aren't very likely to check if you're not a particularly observant player, and they almost act like a series of collectibles that just happen to grant major power buffs for hitting certain milestones. They're a surprisingly fun addition, and I honestly wouldn't mind seeing them or something like them return in future survival horror titles. Going back to the topic of enemies though, I of course have to talk about the main antagonists of Resident Evil 7. The Bakers. Each member of the Baker family has their own unique quirks that manifest in what kind of threat they actually pose to you as a player. For example, Jack Baker is an unkillable monster with incredible strength, which manifests in gameplay as him stalking you throughout the house and trying to kill you. And the only option you have is to run away from him, as your weapons aren't really gonna do anything. And he's actually the first true stalker enemy in the entire series. Unlike the T-103 from RE2 or Nemesis from RE3, who were scripted in ways that made them seem like genuine stalker enemies, but who were both hard scripted to appear in certain rooms at certain points in the story. Instead, Jack can actually chase you through every single room in the house aside from the safe rooms. And when he doesn't know where you are, he'll actually patrol around at random looking for you instead of just despawning and waiting for his next scripted appearance like the Tyrant or the Nemesis. This makes Jack probably the best stalker enemy in the entire series so far. And honestly, my only real issue with him is that he's pretty underutilized due to a combination of him disappearing at a couple points in the story and being dealt with relatively early on in the game. On the other hand though, there's Jack's wife, Marguerite Baker. She's also a stalker enemy during her own portion of the game, but her stalking takes a very different form. Instead of chasing you down herself, if she happens to find you, she'll actually send a horde of bugs to chase you down and attack you instead. This is way more obnoxious than just being chased down by a single hulking brute, but what makes it even worse is Marguerite's incredibly bizarre patrol route. See, Marguerite is encountered in the old house of the property rather than in the main house, which is a much smaller area by comparison. Because of this, Marguerite can only patrol between 2 rooms and the single hallway that connects them, which might initially seem like it makes her easier to deal with, but the thing is, those 2 rooms and hallway just so happen to be the ones that connect the safe room of this area with the actual points of interest within it. So anytime you need to take a quick lap to the item box, you'll need to sneak by Marguerite twice in order to do so, or just try to outrun her swarm of bugs. This placement is kind of baffling to me, as making it so that she always just sits between the points of interest and your item box feels like it's intentionally set up to just be as annoying as possible, and has always made Marguerite my least favorite of the Baker family by far. However, Jack and Marguerite's son Lucas is probably the most unique of the bunch. Lucas is more brains than brawn, so instead of trying to kill you directly, he's instead converted the property's barn into an elaborate series of death traps, molded ambushes, and even some incredibly intricate escape room style puzzles that you have to solve to progress. This makes his part of the game much less about managing your inventory and fighting enemies, and much more about solving puzzles, and seeing how you're about halfway through the game at this point, it's a really nice change of pace. So overall, all 3 of the Bakers are super unique to one another, and going from one of their sections to the next really shakes up the gameplay and makes for some incredible pacing. But that brings us to what is easily my single biggest issue with Resident Evil 7, the pacing. Now, I know what I just said. All of the Bakers and their different sections are wonderful for the pacing and never fail to keep things fresh and engaging. But the issue here lies within something that I said about Lucas's section. That being that his section comes at roughly the halfway point of the game. After you're done dealing with Lucas, you actually leave the Baker estate, and this is where the game becomes a total slog. And while it's pretty normal for Resident Evil games to have noticeably weaker pacing in the second half than in the first, I mean, look at literally any mainline Resident Evil title and you'll probably find that that's the case, RE7 is probably the most extreme example of it in the entire series. First, you'll go to this wrecked ship for a while that doesn't ditch the classic survival horror style, but it does have some incredibly linear level design, meaning that instead of exploring on your own, you're pretty much always limited to going to the one exact spot that Capcom wants you to at that point. And that's not even mentioning that you lose all of your items when you arrive here and start over from scratch, meaning you don't even get a consistent sense of progression with the earlier half of the game here. Then after that, you'll actually be given back all of your stuff from the first half, but you'll enter what's easily the worst area in the game, the salt mines. This area is essentially just a straight line that you walk down while shooting a ton of molded, making for a very action-packed final area. It feels very RE4 in terms of its level design, but without all of the enemy variety and unique sandbox interactions that actually make RE4's combat enjoyable, so it essentially boils down to a linear shooting gallery in a game with very mediocre shooting. It's just a brutally paced final act to an otherwise pretty great game, and it never fails to bring my fun with RE7 to a screeching halt every time I replay it. Now, that's not to say that the bakers are perfect either, because they're certainly not. Something I forgot about until this recent revisit to 7 was just how gimmicky the boss fights in this game are, and honestly, it drove me crazy. A lot of these fights have nothing to do with how you manage your health or your ammo, or even your mechanical skill when it comes to things like aim or positioning. They mostly just come down to whether or not you know the gimmick at the start of the fight. Like the fight with Jack in the garage pretty early on in the game, where it seems like you're just supposed to keep your distance from him and shoot at him, but you actually can't kill him by doing this. What you're actually supposed to do here is find the keys to the car on this shelf, and then get in and try to hit him with it. So contrary to how it initially appears, you can actually beat this fight without firing a single bullet or using a single healing item. Almost every boss fight in the game has something like this, and the worst part is, the fights that don't are so much fun. Like seriously, when they just let the boss fight be a normal battle against a really strong enemy, it's a blast in this game. But when they come down to just dying a couple times before you find the gimmick that lets you win, they kind of feel like an annoying chore. The one thing I will say though is that a lot of these gimmick fights did allow them to make some incredibly gruesome death animations for them, and these are so awesome that I'm not even mad about dying whenever I get one to trigger. Thankfully though, the frustration that fights like this would normally cause have been massively reduced by the introduction of a very forgiving save system. The developers of Resident Evil 7 decided to not bring back the classic ink ribbon save system from the earlier entries in the series, as it was always a pretty large barrier to entry for newer players. So instead, you can now just save as often as you want to, as long as you're willing to walk to a safe room in order to do so. And they've also introduced some checkpoints that will activate just before any particularly dangerous encounter, so you'll never lose more than a few minutes of progress when moving through what would otherwise be some of the most frustrating parts of the game. Now, as a fan of the classic survival horror entries in the series, I personally would have preferred if they had just stuck with the ink ribbon system here, as I've always found it to be one of the most unique and exciting parts of the classic Resi formula. But at the same time, I've never been bothered by this change because I understand that the ink ribbon system is something that has single-handedly turned a large number of potential fans away from those earlier games. So ultimately, I'm just glad that I never lost 30 minutes to an hour of progress to not understanding a boss fight gimmick beforehand. And overall, I really enjoy Resident Evil 7. Back in 2017, I was one of the many fans that were super skeptical of this game leading up to its release, and that opening hour did nothing but seemingly confirm all of my worst fears about the game. But this really is classic Resident Evil down to its core. In spite of its new setting and perspective, they really managed to capture what made those earlier titles so special. And fans of the classic fixed camera survival horror entries in the series will definitely find plenty to love here. It certainly has its problems, from the weird visual issues to some really inconsistent pacing, but overall, this was easily the most fun I've had with any game in this series since RE4. And I know that a lot of this video came off a little ranty, but that's only because there are so many areas where RE7 gets so close to being perfect, only to mess up the execution in some really small way at the last second. Despite that though, I still highly recommend that if you're a classic era fan who's stayed away from this one over the years, because I know there are still a ton of you out there, take it from me, quite possibly one of the biggest fixed camera Resi fanboys you'll ever come across, this is a game that you will absolutely love. And you need to do yourself a favor and pick it up on sale sometime so you can experience it for yourself. And that goes both ways too. If you're a fan of RE7 who's never checked out those fixed camera titles because you think they just look really old and dated, you really should go and give those a try sometime too, because I'm telling you, everything that you love about Resident Evil 7 is there just as much, if not more so. At the end of the day though, I'm going to give Resident Evil 7 Biohazard an 8.4 out of 10. That's gonna wrap up this video, but definitely be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't seen them already, and if you're feeling like checking out something new today, then definitely also take a look at this series I've been doing on the Yakuza games lately. Thank you for watching all the way through, and as always, an extra special thank you to the channel members and the patrons who generously contribute to the channel and make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like on it, as it really does help me out with the algorithm a lot, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more reviews like this one in the future. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.